Novels seem to be flirtations with different ways of telling our own stories. And sometimes that is what is most appealing about a new novel, one where the mystery is still intact, is there is a bit of wondering, how is this story going to tease out another way of seeing the world? The maniacal seem to embody that flirtatious rendering of different interpretations of existence. And it is that kind of embodying of the strangeness, the different directions you can go that are quite unexpected, that makes a maniacal figure quite unnerving, but also it makes them an opportunity for different experiments with ways of living or existing in the world. The books I'm going to show today are very loosely connected to this notion of mania. Either they're going to be particularly strange, venturing off in odd directions or presenting some kind of format or storytelling break, or they're going to be perhaps just focused on a figure wrapped in obsession or recklessness. It's just going to be a series of invitations into other kinds of stories, some less conventional, or some viewing the conventional in a filter of the unusual, such that you can see it in a different kind of way. The first book on this list, it's going to be obvious why it's here, just based on the title. And that's going to be The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut. Now, of all the books that I'm going to show, this is probably the tamest in terms of style. I think it's fitting to start this list with this book because it presents the extreme end of mania, and that is the opposite of what is particularly expected, right? Instead of someone who is untethered from grounding, we have instead someone so tethered to something that feels tight and solidified, such as the logic of their argument, that they can begin to cut away the noise outside of that argument, and sometimes that noise is other people. In this book, The Maniac, we circle around this historical figure, John von Neumann, who is a kind of polymath, dipping his toes into some of the most advanced areas of learning of the early 20th century. That includes things like predictions of the weather or his own attempts to control the weather, early computer science, especially building up and leading into artificial intelligence, the Manhattan Project and the atomic age that follows from that, mathematics generally, in an attempt to make mathematics pristine and perfect and systematic, and then of course Gödel's breakdown of that possibility, and what John von Neumann is most known for, game theory, which attempts to map out the opportunities contained within competitive and or cooperative situations, and then tries to discover the efficient means through that to reach certain ends, such that, you're accounting for the interests of other minds and taking into consideration competing desires, how complicated that makes decision making when you're not just alone in a room being able to rationalize your way to some conclusion. Instead, you have to include other people's considerations. It's somewhat ironic that John von Neumann is known for this game theoretic foundation, because he himself is seemingly so odd in comparison to many of the humans around him. The way that this book chooses to play with that oddness is to treat him, and of course this is a historical fiction work, so it's not nonfiction in the sense of just trying to teach us facts. It's rather taking this historical character and giving us a filter of fictionalizing around him. The way that it chooses to tell the story of this intelligent figure is to treat him as if he's an alien in comparison to all the other minds around him. And these minds who are looking at him from afar, these are some of the smartest minds of their age. And yet, even in comparison to their outlook, they see in him someone above and beyond what they're capable of, at least in his quickness. That's where the mania of Maniac begins, is he's a figure who is so obsessively tied down to the logic of his thinking that he is able to very quickly solve logical problems. But it also makes him estranged from those around him in such a way that they can't connect with him wholly. The book, I think, nicely reiterates that again and again from multiple different characters throughout his lifetime. One failure, perhaps, is the characters' voices themselves don't distinguish from one another in a way that feels real. It really just feels like a distant narrator constantly reminding you of how unusual this person is. I found myself, as I was reading, though, almost relating to John von Neumann, or at least feeling like I understood where he's coming from to an extent, at least the fictionalized version of him. You have this person who has found his place in following a system all the way through to its endpoint. And it makes other considerations feel so much less important. And those who take those considerations as vital to their life, they view ignoring those things as a monstrous choice on von Neumann's part, as if how could you just take these facets of life and just treat them as less ideal. But of course, from the view of von Neumann, it would be precisely reverse. The things that he values feel to him so significant and big that all of these other considerations feel relatively small. And then for everyone else to focus on them as if they are the prime mover of their life. That's this distancing that he's created. And he doesn't leave an anchor behind for him to come back. He's just drifting farther and farther away. And I felt sorry for him in that way as I was reading. He's someone so intelligent that he becomes really useful. He becomes like a calculator for people. And then, of course, they use him again and again for that end. And he takes advantage. It's not like he's a victim in this situation. He's taking advantage of that use. And he garners a great deal of success on the back of his mind and the inventions that he can construct out of that. But then in that constant use of his mind in that way, the people don't really appreciate the emotional side of that impulse. The ways in which, in order to become obsessive, in order to have that mania of obsession, there is an emotional draw always to lead into that compulsion, right? You do not just rationalize your way to an end. Rationality is a tool atop your passions, as Hume would point out. And so he is following his passions just like everyone else is, but he has more complex tools in order to reach those ends. And from afar, it can look like, oh, you're just a machine. But of course, what you're really doing is you're just like us, but you have a means of mapping your way to a farther distance than we can see, and that can feel unnerving and uncomfortable. And I want to start with this book of this extreme rationality, because I think so many of the strangest fiction that we can read, or the people who can unnerve us most, there is something very relatable about their impulses. It's just their impulses are different than yours. But that feeling of being compelled emotionally is very similar in spite of those vast gulfs of differences. So I found The Maniac an interesting book to get through just to think about those differences between the highly rigidly rational and those who are more conventionally inclined, who at least find comfort in the norms of the day and the ways in which norms can give you permission to feel at least comfortable in the direction that you're heading. And the ways in which those who deviate from the norms, they can notice the exact same thing that you do, which is that they are deviating, and they can feel the discomfort of deviation as anyone else does. But then, because they've already deviated and because people have marked them as deviants in that sense, they now have no other choice but to just continue in that direction. And it almost feeds itself. The opinion of strangeness from afar becomes a reinforcement of that strangeness in the person's identity. And that's fascinating to me. And this book opens with such a strong opening. And I know immediately, as soon as I say I'm going to read something from a book, a bunch of viewers are just going to cut away. That's interesting in itself, just as a testament to the ways in which, as soon as you have to read text, you know it's going to slow down. There's going to be a lack of verve that would otherwise be there from extemporaneous speech. But I challenge you to just slow down and take in the text and try not to just click away and jump to the next chapter. Because I think this is a great example of an opening that symbolizes a lot of what the whole book ends up being about. On the morning of the 25th of September 1933, the Austrian physicist Paul Ehrenfest walked into Professor Jan Watering's Pedagogical Institute for Afflicted Children in Amsterdam, shot his 15-year-old son Vasily in the head, then turned the gun on himself. Paul died instantly, while Vasily, who suffered from Down syndrome, was in agony for hours before being pronounced dead by the same doctors who had cared for him since his arrival at the Institute in January of that same year. He had come to Amsterdam because his father had decided that the clinic where the boy had spent the better part of a decade, located in Jena, in the heartland of Germany, was no longer safe for him, with the Nazis in power. And I say that opening is symbolic of the whole work because the decision that Paul Ehrenfest makes for this murder-suicide of his poor son is one that to him is preventative of a worse outcome. And it's his belief that my son will suffer and die inevitably within this Nazi regime. And so therefore I must kill my son as a kind of mercy. And that's a logic that he's following, right? He's just following the steps of if this, then this, if this, then this, and it makes sense within a logic. Of course, within any logical argument, you're presuming constraints to a certain extent. So he's presuming that things have to have this outcome, that there isn't a cascade of decisions in the midst of those premises that he's linking together. And that is so much of what the book circles around because there's two major contributions that the central character John von Neumann makes. And that is to the Manhattan Project. And through his game theoretic approach to problem solving, this notion of it's best for us to create an atomic bomb because then we have the assurance that if you were to attack us, we have a means of returning the attack. And it seems inevitable that these other countries are going to develop a bomb, so we might as well develop our own. And then it's through mutually assured destruction that we can limit the overall damage, or at least that's the logic, right? And just like the opening character in this book, Paul Ehrenfest, has a logic to rush into destruction in the killing of his own son, there's this logic here to rush into the creation of one of the most destructive devices we've ever created, in the logic of, oh, this is a greater end than the alternative. And just like that logic in the beginning, it assumes a whole lot about the inevitability of things. I mean, for one thing, it assumes a kind of particular rational agent that is very much like ourselves on the other side of the ocean. And of course, that isn't at all guaranteed. But it also is constrained by very limited sense of what the damage to be done will be, in that the creation of atomic weaponry and the accumulation of it also has various other costs that will outlast all of us. And that is sort of an intriguing limit in terms of what it considers. But then maybe it is right. Maybe there is a kind of inevitability. At least there certainly seems to be in the science, because it seems inevitable that we will figure out how to create an atomic bomb, so might as well get the jump on it before it gets ahead of us, before someone else has access to it and then they use it against us. But then, of course, that also fuels them to create it, because there's this logic that, oh, if you're going to do it, then I'm going to do it. And so it just makes me think about how through a logical structure, we can reach such a horrifyingly, seemingly irrational end. And that is a kind of mania, right? The mania of accumulation of atom bombs and then eventually hydrogen bombs. And these weapons become all the more powerful. The kinds of bombs that we have access to now are thousands of times more powerful than what we had used during World War II. And then, of course, it leads into that another inevitability, and that is the inevitability of artificial intelligence. And it builds into that because that is the other major contribution that John von Neumann put forward. His own maniac machine, his attempt to control the weather, not just predict it. And the weather is, of course, something so complex in its stochasticity that it requires a great deal of computation in order to contend with. Through his figuring out of the maniac machine and also his figuring out of replicators, how to create a perfect copying of a set of instructions that includes the instructions to then copy furthermore, much like our DNA in our bodies. He was hoping to mimic the neural network array of our own minds with an artificial intelligence machine. And then the book is building with this, like the fancy structure that any good fiction book can allow for. it's able to create a sense of momentum between all these ideas as if it were inevitable that we would have artificial intelligence. Much like von Neumann felt it was inevitable that we would have atomic weaponry. There's this feeling like, well, there's nothing else we could have done different. The artificial intelligence is going to arrive, whether we like it or not. And that's what that whole book sort of arcs toward, is this strange alien person who to other people felt like a machine and was used like a machine. He himself creates a machine to be used. But then, just like him, it will take our norms and conventions and use it as an accumulation of data. And then it will process that data in ways that we can't necessarily account for. And it will have an influence back onto us. And that influence will feel superior because we have this authority tied to it that, oh, this AI must be superior to our little minds. And then, of course, it then makes us just follow. And it has that feeling of inevitability now. Our minds are, of course, limited by whatever tool we have access to. So if the tools we have access to are always external to ourselves, then that creates a kind of fragility, because then suddenly, if that thing is gone, then we don't have it internally. We don't have a guarantee of it. So as much as we allow the machines that we create to just adopt whatever skill sets we otherwise would have been good at, then we are making the availabilities of those tools all the more limited, because it is something outside of us. It's not something that we have fostered within ourselves. And that is something kind of fascinating about the nature of our progression forward. In using the book, The Maniac is like that one extreme of the highly rational obsessiveness of mania. It gets me thinking about that central narrative that we seem to have of the opposing sides of our rationality and our emotion. This idea that one side of our thinking is highly rational and in control, and the other side is just all impulses, drives. But of course, they have to be entwined. There is no way to separate the two, but we conveniently separate them again and again. You see this with Nietzsche and his Dionysian and Apollonian distinction. You see this with Plato's charioteer, the rational side trying to control the other impulses. You see this with Freud and the id and the ego, and just this, the unconscious is like this carnal base that is hidden away from the more rational mind that accounts for social faux pas and things of that sort. This sort of narrative of that split between the two makes it very easy to forget how necessary our goals are to actually using any kind of rationality. And it leads to rationalization, which rationalization is not being more rational. All rationalization is taking whatever your emotional impulse already is and just forcing it to fit, and then using the language of logic in order to make it fit tighter and tighter, such that you can feel certain about your ends, because at least it has the gloss of rationality. There's this book that kind of plays with that. It's called Irrationality by Justin E. Smith. And this one just plays with the history of irrational impulses and how vital they are to our innovations in scientific history. It doesn't try to make an argument that the irrational is necessary to scientific progress. It rather seems to just paint a picture of, here are examples of what at the time was deemed highly irrational, and how once that construction becomes normalized, it then becomes what's rational, and then it ebbs into now the rational is what's followed, and then something highly irrational emerges, and then eventually, and it's kind of like this little back and forth, this dialectic, as some people would use the term. And it's certainly an interesting idea to just remind yourself how much those two sides of our thinking are so wound up into each other cyclically. This base of having an effectance motive, such that we want to be goal-oriented and to pursue puzzle solving, and that reinforces a rational construction towards those ends. But then, of course, the very want itself is not per se rationally justified. It just uses rationality like a tool. And that split is not so perfectly divided as it seems. And there is a loss to only focus on one over the other. It reminds me a bit of, there's in the book Big Bang by Simon Singh, he has a series of charts where he shows the progression of scientific ideas. So we have the heliocentric versus geocentric theory of the solar system, whether or not the Earth is the center or the sun is the center. And he makes the very straightforward point that based on the information we had access to at various points in time in history, it was unreasonable to actually believe the true thing, which is that the sun is the center of our solar system. Based on what we had access to, it was actually more reasonable to believe the untrue thing. I like those charts because it is a good reminder of, for one, a way to understand the lack of foolishness of those in generations past. They really did not have access to the same information that we have. It's also a reminder of the tentative quality of the scientific method generally, that it can only build off of tests, and tests themselves can only really falsify. So there's always going to be this process of rejection of ideas over time and a constant reevaluation of what counts as rational. And so the rational and the irrational are always going to kind of ebb and flow in their own ways. And that is an interesting aspect of the mania that we can judge from afar. The ways that what can seem so off kilter now can be a potential for something to understand about how to think in the world. And that doesn't mean we should just swallow up every appealing idea, because our impulses are just as limited as someone who is highly bound to logic. We can be highly bound to impulse. It doesn't make us smarter. Just because something is more intuitive doesn't make it right. It just makes it more intuitive. Just because something logically follows doesn't make it right. It just means that it logically follows. There's a limit to what you can bind. And what it requires of you is to always be on the lookout for wrongness, or at least be open to the idea of perpetual wrongness. And maybe that's a better state of mind to be in. Instead of one that is always seeking certainty, it could be perhaps better to be one always seeking doubt. Of course, we are cycling ourselves down within technology toward more and more control, and that control includes over ourselves. And within the control over ourselves, we then get to model ourselves by what we see of the world. So our current perception then controls what we desire, and then we can then mold ourselves within that desire. And there's a great fiction book that I think fits this mania category quite well, and that is Voss, an Opera in Flatland by Steve Tomasula. And Steve Tomasula is an author I became aware of because he was the editor of Conceptualisms, which is a collection of experimental literature, or at least conceptual writing, which the only thing to know about conceptual writing is, rather than treat writing strictly as an art object in itself, you value it through the concept that it reveals about something bigger. That can be very unappealing to a lot of people. A lot of abstract art can fall into that, and people rightfully notice that the appreciation of that work doesn't come from the work itself. It comes from what that work seemingly symbolizes about other broader subjects. And then that makes people note that, oh, okay, well then that art object is worthless in itself. But I think they kind of miss the point, because a lot of times all art objects are worthless without a certain parameter of scene involved in their appreciation. The point of a lot of these conceptual works is to at least give you a chance to try to see with a different frame. There is something satisfying about doing that, about just sort of experimenting with frames. Ideally, in my view, not to settle down, but merely to play, intellectual play, and just the fun in the intellectual play. And I think there is fun to be had in that kind of play. This author, Steve Tomasula, in this book, Voss, he tries to toy with this notion of DNA and how we are going to begin to be able to construct our progeny on the basis of our own ends. He makes the book itself a copy of the body in various ways, with imagery that presents bodies, but also he copies the concept of this other book, Flatland, which is about 2D characters discovering three-dimensionality. But instead of having the characters in this book actually be 2D characters, they only get the title of 2D characters, like this one's circle or square and things of that sort. But they are fully three-dimensional humans, and so then it makes you think, well, why did he even call it Flatland in the first place if he's not actually going to fully commit to the premise? But what it ends up feeling like is, well, it's just symbolic of a different kind of realization of what we could discover about ourselves when we actually begin to have the chance to mold our bodies, to become fixated on the information of our DNA above the information of what actually is out in the world. We, in a sense, flatten ourselves into numbers. We become text. And so the book is sort of playing with that idea through a weird, not a novel per se. It's not like just a set storyline. It's almost like a series of vignettes or little images of stories. And it all circles around this theme, or at least a good deal of it circles around this theme of the flattening of ourselves. So that is where the flatland seems to come in, or it's at least the flattening of our mindset into just raw data. And the book feels fitting to me for the kind of mania of now, because so much of our interactions is flattening of ourselves for the sake of profiles, for the sake of messaging across thousands of miles, for the sake of even constructing our own communities for ourselves. We are cutting away the inconveniences of information to slot into sort of boxes of interests. Of course, that is freeing in the same sense that being able to mold your own body via CRISPR augmentation of your DNA would be a kind of new freedom. But via that freedom, we sacrifice certain amounts of inconvenience, and we do flatten away to something that is purely mental. We're sort of taking the mental and projecting it out onto the world and forcing it to be something. It's sort of like we can take for granted, and this is a point from The Master and His Emissary. So it's this book, The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, and he makes the point in the second half. This book is all about the hemispheres of our brain, how we have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and how they seem to specialize in certain ways of seeing. And he makes the point eventually that we have begun to construct our world in a right angle way, where we have perfect squares and perfect circles and all of these angles around us. It gives this sense that this is natural to the world, but of course it's only natural to our mind. It's natural to mathematics. But then we put mathematics into the world to make it so real that we can forget how unusual perfection actually is. We start to make the world fit our logic as opposed to having logic properly map out onto the world. Or at least that's the argument in the book. The book Voss has that similar kind of feel where it's just trying to, through a wild experimental fiction, it's trying to contend with that inclination of human beings of control, 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 and how via so much control, we actually limit what we're capable of seeing in our world. We can attain perfection, and then we forget that that perfection is by a standard that came out of convention, not through something truly ideal in any significant way. But we idealize it, and then via the idealization, it then feels, that's the pedestal I want to stand on now. It can remind me of our own mania from time to time, the ways that we can become so obsessive within a specific criteria of perfection. It makes me think of another book that I read a while back. It's called The Mishmeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. And that was his attempt to map out the obsession with intelligence, of being able to test for intelligence. Often those tests began with our bodies and measuring literally the shape of our skulls or the size of our skulls, putting little rices in an empty skull in order to figure out the exact volume of it, and then jumping to all sorts of conclusions about the kind of brain and thus your mind that you would have on the basis of the size of your skull. And then all of these racial notions that map out onto it. And of course, race, just like the logic we were discussing earlier in the video, that is something that you can map perfectly arbitrary categories onto the world, and it can feel pristine because you mapped it to be pristine. That doesn't mean it is natural to the world. So sort of there's always that trick available within a perfect logic. And so this book goes through like the scientific history of that arc of attempts to define people within perfect little segmentations. And of course, the social consequences of that. I remember Stephen Jay Gould at some point makes a remark in the book that there are some questions of such social significance that we will force our science to be able to answer them because we are so desperate to have an answer. But of course, there's nothing that says that it has to be the case, that every whim of what matters to us is going to necessarily be tenable within the scientific method. The scientific method has limits in terms of what it can test for. And that's all it can do is test on the basis of the experiment you construct. There's going to be things outside of its purview always, and that's the nature of it. That's what's so valuable about science, in my view, is the fact that it allows for tenuousness in its conclusions, by and large. If you forget that tenuousness and you forget the limitations, you can feel certain on the basis of scientific knowledge about things that you shouldn't have certainty for. And it's a kind of lack of understanding of the necessary limits within science and how good those limits are. But it's a misunderstanding of what we can know about the world. It is worthwhile to me how some of these books serve as a reminder of how heavily our abstractions can become an imposition onto living, breathing, real people. And perhaps that's our own kind of mania that we can get locked into again and again and again. With this next one, we have an author who's maniacal in his proceedings of how to tell a story. He seems to go out of his way to actively strain the relationship between narrative discourse and the actual embedded structure of what's in the story. He makes it difficult for the reader to always discern what the plot entails or what are the details that matter. And sometimes that difficulty comes with an influx of detail and, or more often, a rearrangement of the traditional chronological and or linearly fashioned structure that we're used to. And this is an author whom I had heard about plenty of times, but whose work I never actually ventured to read because I figured, well, this author is most famous for short stories. He, as far as I know, doesn't have a great big magnum opus novel. I guess I had this bias toward big tome-like books. And so I just saved this author for later, not thinking much of it. But thankfully, because one of you chose to send this book to me, I finally gave this author a chance, and I'm so glad I did. He's really incredible, in my view. And that is Donald Barthélemy, or Barthem, and this is his collected stories that I have. So I have all of the stories spanning his career. He was actually surprisingly popular for such an experimental postmodern author. He regularly posted his stories in the New Yorker. I guess what allows his works to function there, for at least the time that they were being published, is there is a tinge of humor on the very edge of everything that he creates. But what I find so intriguing is how much he uses that humor really as a means of allowing a certain degree of absurdism so that he can communicate something very genuine and emotionally true. And that is the best of what I think postmodern literature can accomplish, is somehow finding the true amidst the extremities of experimentation. In my journey through his works, I find the ways in which his writing is challenging is so appealing to what I think is the worth of certain amounts of challenge in writing. Sometimes if we can't understand a narrative, it can feel as if there's nothing there, like there's nothing to see, and we kind of ignore it. And what I like about what he seems to be doing in a lot of his stories is he actively obfuscates the narrative in order to, from my view, really emphasize the emotions at play at the center of these characters' desires. And it makes it so that you don't get so caught up in the momentum of the plot, and instead you can just free associate between the different impressions of people and their world. Like he does this technique, it's almost like a cut-up technique, although I don't think it follows that creation process. But he does this thing where he tells stories in like these compact little scenes that are interspersed and split amongst each other. It's almost like they're cut into strips and then overlapped, such that you have multiple different stories happening at one time, and they are seemingly completely unrelated. So he has this one story, the Vienna Ball, which is at its core about a young woman entering into the world of fame and success, but interspersed within that narrative is lines about a surgery happening, and then interspersed in that are various lines about a company and its manufacturing, and interspersed with that are other details that confuse the narrative, and it's this constant shuffling and confusing of what you're supposed to be paying attention to. This feeling like, why am I suddenly hearing about the surgery happening? And then in the midst of that, that gets cut short. And now you're hearing about this company and this long list of materials that it has. And in the midst of that, that gets cut short. And you're hearing about this young girl entering a new apartment and making a friend. And then in the midst of that, it gets cut short. And you're back to details of manufacturing. And at no point does all of this come together into something that you can coherently meld into one piece. But it's the constant contrast of that. It's that seeking of the central story of the young woman that ends up making it so that all of these disruptions make her story rise all the more. And it's this strange effect of you needing to push your way through what is otherwise a confusion that makes those sorts of stories feel powerful in a different kind of way. It reminds me a little bit of like Cubist art, where you have the artist looking at a single object from different angles. So you have the three-dimensional view in the process of creating that piece of artwork. But then what the artist does is from each of those different angles, they then cut away and two-dimensionalize it and then cascade them in a kind of collage, such that you're getting all of the different angles of this three-dimensional object flattened out, but presented at once, as if the chronology of impression of the object were disrupted and smashed into one flat space. And that feeling is captured in a lot of his different stories when he kind of smashes together these multiple different storylines, one on top of the other. It makes it so that I find myself rereading them always. It's such a nice experience the second time through. The first time through is almost pure confusion, but I'm trying to pay attention to names and pay attention to impressions and pay attention to anything of significance. And it's that need to attend so carefully that then makes it so that when I go back a second time through, it suddenly flows in a way that feels so distinct to the first time through that story. And I love that effect and how well he pulls it off again and again. And it makes it feel worth the struggle through the confusion. It makes it feel like, oh, okay, now I know the central through line that matters here. And then I can just take in the distractions and start to wonder more about the thematic significance of those distractions. And it feels of a piece, even though initially it feels so jumbled and confused. But he doesn't do that with every single story. He doesn't make every single story quite that abrasive in its narrative intrigue or tension. In many ways, each story ends up being a new set of rules that you have to figure out. It reiterates a kind of strangeness, a lack of comfort. You know, instead of just reading a short story that you can sense the arc of the plot almost immediately, a lot of these stories instead become about staying in that discomfort, in that space of being estranged from the foundation of structure that you're used to. That, to me, in and of itself, is so much of the emotion that seems to be attempting to be captured by this author in each of these works. He has, for instance, there's one story called Me and Miss Mandible, and I'll read the beginning just to give you a sense of how weird and humorous it seems at the start. Miss Mandible wants to make love to me, but she hesitates because I am officially a child. I am, according to the records, according to the gradebook on her desk, according to the card index in the principal's office, 11 years old. There is a misconception here, one that I haven't quite managed to get cleared up yet. I am in fact 35. I've been in the army. I am 6'1". I have hair in the appropriate places. My voice is a baritone. I know very well what to do with Miss Mandible if she ever makes up her mind. In the meantime, we are studying common fractions. Now, what you get with this story is an immediately absurd premise of this adult figure being forced into an elementary school classroom, and the teacher knowing, or at least having an inclination that he's older than he seems, and this idea of that absurdity of him being so obviously an adult, and yet no one taking notice or valuing that distinction. But as the story goes along, you also start to get a sense of why it is that he had to be thrust back into elementary school in the first place. And the story really becomes less about this comedic, strange tale of an adult in an elementary school classroom, and more about this adult who failed at being an adult, who couldn't quite live up to the standards and expectations of whatever the norms of his day were. And it's that feeling of not being able to live up to others' expectations, but also not being able to just get along with what you're supposed to be doing in your life. That becomes the central core of the story. It illustrates so nicely what I continuously find in Barthelme's stories. And that is this author who is using the extremes of what storytelling allows for. You to just go completely in directions that are as unrealistic as possible in order to have the emotional heft rise to the top. And that becomes the core that you linger on that you cling to in order to stay buoyed up above the otherwise cacophonous waves beneath. And it's just this feeling like, okay, I'm so disoriented by the strangeness of the story. And then you can find your orientation with the human core at its center. He seems to use that distance from reality to really create an alienating effect for you, the viewer. And then that's also often the subject matter of the story, is that feeling of alienation from others, or a kind of loneliness in the midst of a populated space. And so it's like populating the storyline with all of these richness of characters, these characters who seem all okay in the scenario that the main character is in, even though the main character can tell that something is off, that things are not right. And it's that distance of perception, the ways in which the protagonist can feel like, wait, I'm seeing everything is all wrong. Why is no one else seeing it the way that I'm seeing it? And then everyone else just trying to get along and just telling them, no, it's fine. And it's that existentialist absurdism of noticing a kind of arbitrariness to things. And the storytelling here just makes itself so blatantly arbitrary that it puts you in that space, or that headspace of feeling like you're not getting along with the norms that are surrounding you. That feeling of not getting along is something that when you connect to it, when you relate to how lonely that can feel, it then allows for communicating a very specific kind of heartache. And that is a heartache of someone who just feels, no matter the state of progress that they're in physically, in terms of just getting by in day-to-day life, they can't seem to get a foothold on ground that feels solid enough for them to just wade in calmly. They're always struggling against whatever the current is of the day. And it's this feeling of wanting to be able to relax, but not being able to stop noticing how wrong it feels to be in this space. And it's just constant wrongness in his stories, back to back to back. And it's maniacal in the sense of always judging from inside of someone, the society at large, but using humor and absurdism to make those judgments feel internalized by you as you read. You feel it the whole way through, the sense of constant alienation and discomfort. And if you find life discomforting, it can feel really comforting to have a work be discomforting too. It sort of feels familiar, and it's like, thank you for capturing that for me. And I like that sense in a lot of Barthelme's stories. There's a certain kind of logical distance that shows up in these stories. There's this feeling like, oh, this author is using their cleverness in order to mask emotion. That's often the criticism that gets levied at postmodern literature is, oh, it's all just clever. There's a total lack of emotion because all it's doing is just trying to outsmart you all the time. And I feel like it sometimes misunderstands the value of that kind of distancing, because I think the purpose of writing like that, of getting so maximalist in the detail and getting confusing and kind of weird, I think it's so often to actually capture something that feels very genuine. It really does capture a feeling of weirdness in someone's day-to-day life. And not everyone's brain makes them feel so disconnected in that way, but some people's brains do. It's nice to have these kinds of stories that play with that side of living, that is just always uncomfortable and feeling incapable of shutting off its thoughts. It's that non-silencing that can be painful. And it's nice to have certain writers, and some of them often are the postmodern ilk, who illustrate the mania of that, the mania of not being able to shut off. It reminds me a little bit of like a point that Robert Sapolsky makes in his book Behave, which is all about the processes of our decision making. He sort of clings on to the process of a moment of deciding to commit violence versus a moment of committing to love. And it's that kind of divergent path of our bodies. He uses that divergent path to sort of talk about what are all the steps in that decision making. And there's one point in the book, it's a phenomenal science book, a book of neuroscience, really explaining the brain, but also just explaining the process of decision making that emerges in one's brain. In the midst of that, he makes this brief point about how sometimes sensitivity, which is seen as a purely positive thing, oh, look at you, you're so sensitive to someone else's feelings, that sensitivity can just make you shut down, because now someone else's feelings is overwhelming. And so instead of being someone who's sensitive and now that means I'm caring, your sensitivity actually makes you distance more. And I find so often with these authors who get accused of being distant in their emotional register. I think what they are illustrating, at least in the ways that mirror my own feelings sometimes, is that distance is a kind of safety from the pain of accumulating too much of the detail, putting too much attention onto the emotion, because it can be overwhelming in every mind that you come across. If you become too empathetic, you actually shut down your capacity to be effective in helping someone else. Like, think of the doctor who would have so much empathy that they couldn't commit a surgery. There has to be a certain amount of shutting off those feelings in order to do something truly helpful. There's that feeling sometimes in these postmodern stories where they're really over the top in their granularity. That feeling to me is one of being overwhelmed by emotion and then using the structure of being able to segment and organize things in order to put yourself back again into a space of steadiness. But of course, that sensitivity, that being on the brink of slipping off again, is always going to be there. Some authors capture that perfectly. I think that's partially the appeal for many of David Foster Wallace. It's the same kind of thing. It's someone who's highly intelligent, but you can tell that that intelligence is always on the brink of some kind of emotional collapse. And Bartholomew feels to me it's different than David Foster Wallace in that he actually is more strategic, I think, in his placement of that kind of mania. But he still, to me, registers a lot of pain in his writing, masked by a lot of scaffolding of structure and posed intelligence. And the very first story in his collection is all about that kind of posing of intelligence. It's about a main character who's meeting with a boss who can fire him or give him a promotion. And he ends up trying to impress her the whole way through. But then there's a point very early on where he's also acknowledging that so much of what this character is doing to impress his boss is exactly the same thing the author is doing to impress us. It's using all of the accumulated knowledge that he's gained and his capacity to articulate elegant prose that is also a kind of desperation, as if we, the reader, are the boss of the writer. He communicates this early on from an article in the Journal of Tension Reduction. One source of concern in the classic encounter between patient and psychoanalyst is the patient's fear of boring the doctor. The doctor, no doubt, is also worrying about his life, unfolding with 10 minutes between hours to smoke a cigarette in and wash his hands in. Reader, we have roles to play, thou and I. You are the doctor, washing your hands between hours, and I am, I think, the nervous, dreary patient. I am free associating, brilliantly, to put you into the problem, or for fear of boring you. Which? And it's that putting us into the problem that I think Bartholomew is doing again and again in his stories. He is dreadfully aware of boring us, and so he inundates with information, but then that neediness is also always on the cusp and there. And it's that neediness, that dreadful dreariness of despairing over how easily it could be to lose that connection with someone. That is there in every story. And so I think it's a perfect example of the human in the mania. The ways that an author can actively be pushing you away while holding you tight. And if you notice that they're holding you, you can realize how much intimacy there is in that distance. I hope that you don't take as long as I did to start reading Donald Bartholomew, because I found it so much better than I expected. And I'm so appreciative that one of you got me that book so that I can enjoy his collected works. I read almost every story more than once. I just want to briefly say thank you to the person who got that for me. The next bit of strangeness comes from the realm of science or philosophy. And this is the classic work, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. This is a wonderfully strange book that isn't the kind of book that I would say you should read because you're going to learn some direct fact about the world. It's more the journey of this person accumulating evidence and then making an argument out of that evidence in such an unusual direction. That journey is in and of itself fascinating. And it's a perfect example of how really good science writing can make even the most bonkers scientific notion feel near to intuition. What Julian Jaynes ends up striving to accomplish in this book is he wants to give like a history of the brain and its evolution into the current mind that we have, the kind of conscious state that we exist in. And I should explain that his view of consciousness is a very kind of limited view. It's an introspective consciousness. It's not merely being aware of the world. It's actually actively introspecting and looking in. He starts to make a claim that that kind of consciousness did not exist for a majority of human history. That for the bulk of early humanity, we existed in a kind of algorithmic function within the world. We just sort of responded directly to things. We did not reflect back in on ourselves until much later. So he makes this wild claim that via our use of language, which was initially quite instrumental, the hemispheres of our brain, right to left, began to bridge over time in such a way that we started to actually be able to have an inner voice. He says that the early effect of this bridging is that the voices of the gods that you would hear about in classic mythology or other ancient stories was really the voice of the right hemisphere attempting to speak to the left. And because that bridge between the hemispheres hadn't been fully settled into place, it seemed like a voice from afar. And it was only later in time that that voice began to be internalized as ours. So the bold claim that he's making in this book is that we were not conscious for a majority of our human history, and that consciousness only emerged through the use of language, through the ability to take outside objects and name them, and then to notice that we ourselves are an outside object in the eyes of others. And so we can name ourselves internally within the moniker I. And via placing that label of I onto ourselves, suddenly we gain the capacity to introspect. It's quite a convoluted theory for him to construct, and the science in it is not the sort that can be tested, and so it doesn't seem to me reliable in that way. However, it's such a fun ride to go along with this author. His use of language is quite beautiful throughout, in spite of the scientific subject matter. For instance, to introduce his book, he says, "Oh, what a world of unseen visions and heard silences, this insubstantial country of the mind. What ineffable essences, these touchless rememberings and unshowable reveries, and the privacy of it all, a secret theater of speechless monologue and prevenient counsel, an invisible mansion of all moods, musings, and mysteries, an infinite resort of disappointments and discoveries. A whole kingdom where each of us reigns reclusively alone, questioning what we will, commanding what we can. A hidden hermitage where we may study out the troubled book of what we have done and yet may do. An introcosm that is more myself than anything I can find in a mirror. This consciousness that is myself of selves, that is everything and yet nothing at all. What is it? And where did it come from? And why?" You can feel the poetic lilt of his language amidst his prose. It's that beauty that maintains in the midst of his strongly worded argument for the breakdown of the what he calls bicameral mind, which is the mind prior to the link between the two hemispheres prior to consciousness, and the conscious mind that we now have. To me, it makes this science book feel almost like a great work of science fiction. This strange wondering about what would it be if we did not have consciousness for a majority of our human history. And he uses literature as a lot of his evidence for this, sort of the ways that someone like Homer wrote his Iliad and Odyssey, and the differences over time between how writing is done. It's that using the literary voice to infer about the internal minds of those who were writing, as opposed to thinking of it as merely a convention for the particular day. He views it as somehow indicative of the ways in which we were thinking. And there's a spell that takes over if you read this book long enough. It starts to really feel like, oh, what if this is the case? It really has that wonderful effect of a great science fiction work, of making you wonder and wonder. It's completely maniacal in the sense of being ridiculous. It's very hard to take seriously as hard science, but it is written so nicely that I think just if you want to have fun with your science for a little while, and you do get to learn a lot of the philosophy of consciousness, and you do get to learn a lot of facts about the brain in the midst of the book. It's not all filled with extensive theories that run so far afield of what is known, but his use of that real evidence for this overarching argument about our history, this strong inference that he's making about the kinds of minds that we had, it feels fantastic in so many different ways. If you want to mess around with a science book that isn't going to be referenced as true in this current day, then I highly recommend you check out The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. I should be clear too, when I bring up books like this, I don't really care about whether I agree with a book. If it's interesting, it's interesting. And sometimes, every once in a while, viewers will make a bit of a leap about what they think I think based on what I mention in a video. I want to be clear that you probably cannot figure out exactly what I think about something just because I bring it up in a video. I'm more interested in introducing ideas than arguing for them. I'm going to just continuously introduce whatever I want. If it intrigues me, I hope it would intrigue you. It's just there's some joy sometimes in playing with ideas and just letting them sit in their own regard and allowing them to be strange and to practice in how much our models of the world can sometimes lead us in all sorts of intriguing directions. And it remains merely a model, and you can just look at it and you can enjoy it like a work of art. So books like this is one, I don't want to make an argument that this author is right about what he's saying. I only want to say that the book is really enjoyable for what he's saying. So I think you should just enjoy yourself. The pleasure with so many books is the ways in which they get your mind to stretch, much like a decent stretch in a workout. And that's really all I'm trying to push when I mention these sorts of things. So keep that in mind. Don't assume that you know what I think. I'm trying to avoid just being a teacher, because that's what I do in my day-to-day job. I really just, what is interesting to me, I just want to share it with you. So keep that in mind. The next book is from an author I only recently started getting into. And I can already tell that her style of work is precisely up my alley. And that is Vanessa Place, and in particular her book, La Medusa, which the La could be pronounced L.A. Medusa, as this is a book about a city, but really it's taking, just like the prior book I discussed, it's trying to articulate the ways in which a mind can be an emergent property out of a series of connections. And in the way that the prior book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, is about how our consciousness emerges out of the relationship between the two hemispheres in our brain. The author Vanessa Place treats Los Angeles, the city, as if all of the individuals within it were nodes of connections, of neurons. It has this unusual structure where each section of the book is like a different section of the brain, where Los Angeles itself is a master brain or master mind. It's acting as if the deadness of the city could be made alive by the fervor of the people in it. And she really focuses in on the things that make us distinctively ourselves. There's a lot of ugliness in her writing. And it's the fact that she allows that ugliness to persist and she doesn't shy away from it that I think makes her stand out even more to me as an author. I first learned about Vanessa Place through her anthology, I'll Drown My Book, which is a quote from The Tempest by Shakespeare. And this is a collection of conceptual writing by women. Specifies women in particular because a lot of conceptual writing, that very experimental style, in other collections that I have, such as I showed the book Conceptualisms earlier, it can sometimes feel like a fixation of male writers to experiment, but of course that's not the case. And so this book tries to shine a greater spotlight on all of the many women who are also attempting the same. Often experimentation in form like this is really a questioning of convention. And it's through that act of questioning the convention that you even begin to notice that the convention is there. Through this collection, I looked up the different editors and I found out about Vanessa Place, and I discovered that she is a major writer herself, but she's a particularly maniacal writer in the sense that she looks at a lot of the mores of the day, the things that we just take for granted as necessarily the case. And she seems very open to questioning and pushing back. With her anthology of conceptual writing, she kind of reminds you that you as a reader don't have to take things in passively, that you can notice the paratext quality surrounding whatever it is that you read. And you can notice the choices over top the obvious narrative choices, more the choices of form and decisions around following the conventions of story. and then just making you think again about, well, why follow that? Why is that the necessary way forward? So often, sometimes it can feel like the stories that become popular are just about sending a message and garnering some amount of agreement or applause. And it could be nice when an author, or rather than having a kind of moral play where you can feel self-satisfied, she seems to be an author who is okay with letting things be really ugly and messy. And then you get to make your own decision about what that means to you. Does that ugliness have a kind of beauty in its honesty? Or do you shun the ugly and the gross? And is that your moral compass? It's not about telling you which is right or wrong. It's not about right or wrong. It doesn't have that puritanical edge to it of caring very much about what you think. Her writing seems so much more creating in her fiction this odd kind of documentary quality in terms of what she focuses on. So like a book like La Medusa feels pretty strange as a novel. If what you're used to in a novel is the constant momentum forward and the scaffolding of plot just building and building. Instead, what it feels like is breaking into people's private spaces of their mind, as well as the interior of their car or their home or their office space. She has this frame around the book where each part is often given like a screenplay like starting point, where it says interior or exterior, and then it will describe the setting, and then it will jump into the actual text itself. And then sometimes you also only get dialogue, but you also get things where you have little snippets and cuts. Everything is kind of rearranged and out of order. It's a very messy book in that way, but it's trying to capture this constant connectiveness. It's a book about a city through the individuals within that city. And the freeways themselves are like the vessels of blood that link each of the parts together. It offers up Los Angeles as a grand mixture of pains and aspirations and failures, and then just gives you little scopes into those struggles. It seems to be that we do not get to live as individuals in isolation with a perfect objective sense of the world in which we persist in. Instead, we must be constantly integrated with those around us, such that those people around us are also making us. Vanessa Place is maniacal because she doesn't mind a bit of destabilization, and she will destabilize you in a lot of her writing. And if that's what you crave, to be jostled a bit, then I think she's the perfect maniacal writer for that purpose. The next set of works illustrates the emotional jolt between vertices of experience, and that is in the range of someone like Julio Cortázar's works. You've heard me talk about him before because I've been reading many of his short stories. I started off with Blow Up and Other Stories, which I discussed in a prior video, and then I moved on to We Love Glenda So Much and A Change of Light. And I recently picked up All Fires, The Fire. And I've been jumping from story to story because I find Julio Cortázar doesn't get trapped by his own conventions like some writers do. It feels like between each story is a new experiment on himself as a writer. He seems to be on this elongated journey to communicate the challenges of interpersonal relationships. How we can feel so distant from someone who's physically within close proximity of us. And that distance is almost always one of our interiority. The nature of our subjectivity becomes like a drawbridge drawn up, and the moat of our bodies is a perpetual separation that we can't seemingly escape. He's like a writer like Borges in that he takes ideas all the way to their extreme. However, his ideas always remain centered around simple or obvious emotional core, and it is a kind of lonely emotional core. The fact that he can maintain that through such a strange mix of stories makes Cortázar such a fascinating writer in the execution of his seeming whims from line to line to line. And I've been going through his stories and then moving to his novels. I find that the novels are an even better opportunity for him to really stretch out that stream of consciousness play. There is a novel that one could start with called The Winners, and it is probably his most straightforward of the novels that he's written. It's about a group of people who embark on a luxury cruise together as a result of winning a lottery. And very early on in the book, there is a deviation from the expectations of their winnings. They thought that they were going to be on one ship and they end up on another. And so there's this schism that develops between the group of people who enter onto the ship. There are those who want to just fall back and accept the status quo of what is, as opposed to vying for something more. And then there's another more contentious group that wants to demand and question the situation that they're in. And so that obviously creates this kind of conservative and not split. And the actual crew members are strange in all sorts of other ways. This book, The Winners, becomes Cortázar's way into the central question that he seems to always be toying with, which is, how do we contend with each other? How do we bridge that gap between ourselves? As a first novel, it is just a series of questioning. It doesn't really resolve in the way that some of his stories do. It doesn't give you something to come away with and ponder a little bit deeper and chew on a little bit more. And it's the most traditional novel of his, as far as I know. But there is a taste of some of that deep stream of consciousness like interiority. And that's really where the strength of Cortázar comes in, is his stream of conscious play. He gets to toy with stream of consciousness in a far more satisfying way in some of the later books, such as his work Hopscotch, which I've talked about plenty of times on this channel, so I'm not going to go into detail with. But this one lets you take on the story in a non-linear fashion. You can jump around between the different chapters in the same way that the character is jumping around the city in search of a lost love. And it's that jumping around and non-linearity that captures so much of the tangled loss that the main character himself is going through as he seeks out what is to him a memory, but what he hopes is something genuine, that memory of the relationship that he had with someone else. That seeking out of place in another, that idea that someone else can ground you in some significant way. It seems that Cortázar is always messing around with this idea of other people's psychology being something that can ground you or ground the space that you're in. He has two novels that are the ones that I mainly want to discuss for this set of Maniacal Literature, and that is his posthumously released Final Exam and his later work 62, A Model Kit. And what's interesting about Final Exam is that's where he takes that extreme notion of other people being the ones who ground us, and he starts toying with the idea of this group of people wandering a city, young students who are just contemplating philosophical concepts and meaning. And as they contemplate this, the very city itself begins to lose its own ground. It becomes less consistent, in the same way that the meaning that they discuss maybe becomes less and less consistent. It's called Final Exam because there's supposed to be a final examination like a day later, and it's their avoidance of that cementing of the examination that becomes really the play of living. And in the book 62, A Model Kit, we have Julio Cortázar taking an idea he articulates explicitly in chapter 62 of Hopscotch, of a city that is entirely subjectively bound by the minds of those within it. One that really doesn't have a set reality to it, where it's like a city within a city within a city, and each of those cities within a city is the minds of those who dwell within it. It's an actively confusing book, one that jumps between perspectives, literally like first person, third person, but also jumps between the perspectives of those within the city, and they go from place to place, but the places themselves really only are as bounded as the people themselves are. And 62, A Model Kit, feels like the extreme end of Cortázar's maniacal style. It's such a beautiful, elaborate, stretched stream of consciousness style, flowing from person to person, place to place, idea to idea, and it's just about experience and experiencing experience itself exuberantly, accepting it. It's almost like taking the idea of every person mattering to the point that reality itself can't exist without their perception of it. And it is that taking the solipsistic view of what if there is no reality, what if everything is just phenomena, and it's taking that fully to its extreme extent across an entire novel. I can't sum it up as well as Julio Cortázar did himself. He sums it up in chapter 62 of his book Hopscotch, and it says, "If I were to write this book, standard behavior, including the most unusual, its deluxe category, would be inexplicable by means of current instrumental psychology. The actors would appear to be unhealthy or complete idiots. Not that they would show themselves incapable of current challenges and responses, love, jealousy, pity, and so on down the line, but in them something which Homo sapiens keeps subliminal would laboriously open up a road as if a third eye were blinking out with effort from under the frontal bone. Everything would be a kind of disquiet, a continuous uprooting, a territory where psychological causality would yield disconcertedly, and those puppets would destroy each other, or love each other, or recognize each other without suspecting too much that life is trying to change its key in and through and by them, that a barely conceivable attempt is born in man as one other day there were being born the reason key, the feeling key, the pragmatism key, that with each successive defeat there is an approach towards the final mutation, and that man only is in that he searches to be, plans to be, thumbing through words and modes of behavior and joy sprinkled with blood and other rhetorical pieces like this one. And so it is a book of playing with symbols out of whack and meaning untethered, allowing the characters to be and be and be and be the city themselves. Cortázar is one of those authors where, I only really started reading him in the last year, and I'm finding, just like Donald Barthelme, he's becoming one of my favorite writers. He's so incredible what he's doing. There's a freedom to his style that feels unlike anyone else I've been reading. And I'm excited to get to some more of the writers who people claim are similar to him. The next author on this list is one who's often remarked as similar to Cortázar in the level of experimentation, although he is far less prolific compared to Cortázar. And that is José de Nasso and his book, The Obscene Bird of Night. A book that I haven't read yet, but I know that one of my viewers has. I believe it was Tony who was reading this book a while back. And I would love to hear his thoughts on, now that he's finished it, if it actually lives up to his expectations. But Obscene Bird of Night takes a lot of the ideas I was just talking about with Cortázar, of having our subjectivity rise to the forefront of what holds down the real. And from what I understand, he imagines a place in which there is this aristocratic father who essentially condemns his deformed child to live in a house with other deformed humans. And by that child growing up in that space, he doesn't recognize his own deformity. It is the norm in this space. From the little bit of this book that I've read, there is this constant switching of subjectivity, just like in 62 A Model Kit. There's this jumping in and out of different focalizations, and it doesn't tell you whose point of view you're necessarily in. You kind of have to infer it and figure it out as you go. And it's that confusion of perspective that is a way to remind you of the significance of perspective. When you're constantly changing and then you notice, oh, this is now the mind that I'm in, and I can tell because of this, this, and that. It's really making subjectivity even more explicit while actually making it less explicit in terms of being described. So instead of telling you, oh, now I'm in this mind, it's just making you feel your way through the different minds. This idea of this child growing up in this place of what to others is abhorrent and to this child is the norm. It's almost like how we can get used to things. Things can become normalized, and then that becomes our norm. And it's really only through the eyes of others that we begin to feel the shame that can be so much of the horror of living. It reminds me a little bit of that play. I don't know, I'm sure some of you have read it. You must have, or seen it. No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre. And there's that famous line at the end where it's hell is other people. And for those who've read the play, you understand that it's not saying that hell is other people just because people are annoying or just because they exist. It's more hell is other people because they make you recognize that you exist as an object in the eyes of others. And that there is a room for shame now. There's a room for guilt and really accountability for yourself when others can see you and place their judgments onto you. I'm excited to get to this book. Like I said, I kind of want to finish all of Cortázar, and then I want to finish some of Carlos Fuentes, who I haven't read any of his yet, and then I'm definitely going to get to Obscene Bird of Night. I just wanted to mention the premise of this book because I do think it fits that maniacal tone of a lot of the other works I've been discussing in this video, of just capturing deviancy and also just to reflect on deviancy that causes you to reflect on the nature of deviance and how deviance must be relative to something. That something itself it could be a status quo that people adhere to, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the status quo. And then, of course, we don't just make the world through our perception of it. We also have the capacity to destroy it. And there's a book that I mentioned in a recent video that I just kind of glossed past because I was talking about Daniel Lusky's other works. I think I was talking about the Familiar series. But I want to talk a little bit more about Only Revolutions and suggest it as a kind of maniacal literature. Maniacal in that it captures the mania of expansion through this allegory of a boy and a girl, two lovers, who have this seething desire to conquer and destroy. They are themselves an analogy to the birth of the United States and its westward expansion. And along the margins of this whole book, there is a history of the US in little tiny snippets. And most of that history is undiscernible if you aren't already familiar with the events. But the point is that in the same way that as their lives and as their relationship develops, so too does the history of the US cascade forward. And then as their relationship self-destructs, there's this implication of the US's own implosion onto itself out of an inability to appreciate that our excesses consume us because we habituate to them, and then they become our new norm. And then at some point we're going to reach a standstill where we can't continue to consume without consuming ourselves in the process, that there is going to come a barrier of reality to our desires. I'm not even talking yet about the form of the book. The form of the book is the most maniacal of all. I'll show you some images of it. It jumps back and forth between these two characters. It's written like an epic poem that switches between the two of them. It's like a Mobius strip of their lives together, where it begins from one perspective, and if you flip the book upside down, it has the other perspective. So from boy to girl to boy to girl and back again. You can see the same events twisted from a totally opposite perspective, and they often are very simply just pure contrast to one another. And it's also that feeling of like the way that we talk about the United States. There is a constant polarization and contrast. You could consider it our binary partisanship. And then this book captures this kind of binary between this boy and this girl and their full-on just destruction of the world. They essentially go on a murder spree that isn't explicitly told as murder. You kind of have to figure it out as you're reading that, okay, they're doing something really, truly horrible throughout this book. But their free, loving selves, they can't seem to notice how much freedom they're taking away as they continuously just embrace their own. This obsession with freedom, which is a word that's entirely malleable, right? Freedom to a Democrat is not freedom to a Republican, and yet they both claim to want freedom. So much of politics is just arguing over the word. This boy and this girl in this story are just, they both want freedom, and they don't recognize how different that can be to each other, how different that meaning can be between them. It's a riveting poem that is difficult to read if you try to read it in a traditional sense, because it's really just traveling through time. It's all dream logic the whole way through. But if you read it out loud to yourself almost, and just get the sound of it, the rhythm of it, the pace begins to match the momentum of the history itself. It begins to feel like you're rushing through almost a road trip through US history. And it's quite a strange experience, maniacal in its emphasis on the horrors of our own inability to know when to stop. Halos, hailscarth, contraband. I can walk away from anything. Everyone loves the dream, but I kill it. Bald eagles soar over me. Revel, rebel. I jump free this wheel. On fire, blaze a breeze. I'll devastate the world. No big deal. New mutiny all around, with a twist, with a smile, a frown. Almighty 16 and so free, rebounding without even a cap. Golden bears bow at my knee. Go ahead, Lieutenant General, take it all. American beavers also chitter, scared, bowing, fawning too. Why don't I have a hat? Turning around, a foil wobbles over with soft nose. You're impressive. I pick 'em up. Coyotes add, you impress everyone. Approval unanimous. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy vanguard, surrendering nothing. But April does. This land is my land, treats me reverentially. My force earning thrickety field cricket legs. Mule deers snort, you're our end, cougars purfell. By my hand, fire ants and badgers feud. Glaciers move. That's a beginning. And you get the idea. It's this constant self-obsession in each character's perception of what they're doing. They're so overconfident in their capacity to take and take and take. And that, of course, is precisely what leads to anyone's self-destruction. And it is that persistent extreme that makes Only Revolutions a prime example of maniacal literature. And then we have what is, in the experiencing of it, the most maniacal of all. And that is The Passion, According to G.H. by Clarice Lispector. This is the first Clarice Lispector book that I've ever read. I wanted to thank Emily Clarice Pizzoa for recommending it to me. She knows my taste, having seen many of my other videos, and she wants to share her love of the poetic in fiction, so please check out her channel when you get a chance. She recommended I have this be the start of my entrance into Clarice Lispector because she knows that I like books that are conceptually bound as much as possible and also allow the subjectivity to be at the forefront. Obviously, you can tell by so many of the other books that I mentioned that that is the case. This book really takes that as far as it goes. I found the act of reading The Passion According to G.H. not to necessarily be an enjoyable one, but it was fascinating in just the pure commitment that the author had to a particular mode and point in time. The premise of the book is a well-off character whose maid is no longer in the home, and so she enters the maid's room and there is a cockroach in one of the drawers, and in the process of closing the drawer in shock, she catches the cockroach in between the wood. It's in that moment of the cockroaches dying that this narrator begins to perceive, for just a fraction of a second stretched across the whole book, she begins to perceive the deep time of all living, this shared persistence with herself and this cockroach. This idea that this cockroach is dying in front of her, and there's something so deep in the history of the cockroach, and there's something so far in how she was living, the ways that so much of her living was covering over death and this notion that she will die and that we will all die. And there was so much of her living that was using the comfort of language to distance itself from the reality of what is. The book feels like Clarice Lispector, almost like as if she had just finished reading Wittgenstein or something, toying with how much language can separate. She seems to be, through this character, trying to find what is left if you were to take away the definitions, if you were to just remove the labels step by step. What is so enjoyable about the book, what I find so satisfying in the execution of it, is that what she ends up finding again and again and again as it goes, not really a plot moving forward, it's more an inner self-discovery that's just whirling down, 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 and then there's this cusp of something about to bloom, and it is always just this constant self-discovery that she's going inward toward. But the thing that is so satisfying is that she doesn't solve the problem. She notices the problem of language in every step of the way that she goes in trying to reduce out the truth that's underneath that language. She ends up finding more language and more labeling. And so it becomes like a questioning of all kinds of demarcation of experience. It's not just about language, it's about narrative generally. She starts to even question morality and its existence and the idea of right and wrong and just fixation with having things be orderly. It's just this attempt to escape from the social aspect of being human and get down to the carnal base, animalistic true. And it's this idea that that would be more true, but of course as she goes further and further, it loops in on itself. I found it such a rich experience, not because it was philosophically dense in a logic-bound way, but because it felt so pure in its just curiosity of itself. It felt almost like Clarice Lispector got in touch with that part of ourselves as children when we used to just ask questions and we weren't concerned so much about the validity of it. It was more just the curiosity that was in and of itself its own satisfaction. She has this following of it deeper and deeper. It's this weird torment that you start to slip into as you read this book, almost like a meditation without the drifting off of meditation. As far as maniacal literature goes, I think this one is probably the one that made me feel the most crazy as I was making my way through, because there's so much repetition and because it is so cyclical in its treatment of concepts. I started to feel that ebb and flow in my own thinking as I went along. And it was an excellent book to read in one sitting. You should, if you can. It's not that long. If you look at it, it's this tiny, tiny little thing. If you can, you should try to just sit somewhere and just let yourself fall into it. And it's not a story in the traditional sense. It is just almost an experiment. It's one of those rare books that if you allow it to, it really gives you another frame of thinking. It's almost like you entered into someone else's mind for a little while. And that's always what I seek in different books. And it was nice to get at least a taste of that in The Passion According to G.H. by Clarice Lispector. I think it's a fitting end to this maniacal literature list. I hope you enjoyed hearing about these different books. I've been gone for a while, so I decided to just throw a whole bunch of books at you that I've been reading and some that I anticipate reading. I hope that I will come back to this channel a little bit more often. I want to, in particular, thank Marina, who had purchased 2 of these books for me, The Maniac and The Bartholomew, collection, because I wouldn't have read those if not for her. And especially in the case of Donald Bartholomew, I think really an extraordinary selection stories in there, and so I'm so glad to have that now. I can't tell you enough how much it meant to me when I got those books in the mail. It was a total surprise. Books are everything to me. It's the most satisfaction I can get is often just in a book. I was, to be completely honest, slightly emotional when I got it the first time. So I just want to thank you. You did, I think, send me another book, but I'll have to talk about that in a different video. I can't thank all of you enough for, I've gotten some messages wondering where I've been. There's a lot of reasons I've been pausing. A lot of it has to do with up here. I just thank you for caring. I want to thank Bren Bruce Jones, as always, for reaching out. Yeah, I'll try to do another video when I get a chance. I'll try to be less silent, and I'll see you around. Thanks for watching my Maniacal Literature list. Don't take Maniacal Literature too literally. It's just a loose label. Whatever the defining characteristic of Maniacal Literature is, you can find it in whatever is the thread between all of the books that you just heard. Thank you for watching, as always.